question, right? When I don't understand things, when things seem illogical, I've tried to condition myself to ask questions, to try and learn, to try and see what I might be missing, to try and understand the perspective that seems off to me, rather than jumping to the conclusion that it is off and it is wrong. And, those people need to be better or do it different. I question, I try and understand it. Regardless of the topic, that's what I try and do. The question I have today is around the logic of the kind of identity, I guess I'd call it identity warfare that's going on in the world, the country, the world, society right now. And one particular component of it, right? There's lots to it. And when I say identity warfare, there's a lot of division in the country. Some of it's political, some of it's socioeconomic, some of it's racial, some of it's gender, sexual orientation. It's all different identity wars being waged and fought. And many of them are good, right? They need to be fought. Change is needed. Things have been wrong for too long. People have been mistreated for too long. People haven't stepped up to do the right thing for too long. So I have no issue with the identity warfare. To an extent, warfare is maybe a little strong, maybe. But I don't have issue with that. The thing I have issue with, which a lot of people do, but I'm trying in good faith to understand it better. What a lot of people take issue with is this idea that if you are a part of group X, right, whatever that group is, some group that's engaged in some form of identity warfare with another group or multiple other groups, trying to say like, hey, my group has been mistreated, oppressed, what have you, by group Y or group Z, whoever it is, and that can't stand. It's got to change. It's got to change now, right? I get that. But what often happens is there's this approach of, unless you are part of my group, unless you are in group X, I don't want to hear from you on this topic. I am going to tell you the problems. I'm going to tell you what needs to be done differently and what your group needs to do differently. And I'm, in many cases, I'm not trying to say this is always, but in many cases, I'm going to demand that you do the things I say. Naturally, people take issue with that, right? They're not comfortable with the idea that you can have a view or a belief or make a demand or whatever it is, and that it can't be questioned. Right? You've seen it all over the news, all different ways, right? I'll just stick with the group X to not make it personal, but all different ways in which somebody from outside of group X questions. Sometimes people within group X question and they get eliminated from group X. They get told, you're not really part of this because you can't question it. And people's concern there is the obvious one. When something can't be questioned, when you give it almost absolute power, what safeguards do you have that they're not going to abuse that power? How can you be sure you're doing it the right way, you're handling it right? Our whole system of government, whether you agree with it or not, is built on this premise of checks and balances. Now, whether it's executed right, different story, but the principle I think most people understand and agree with, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. You need checks and balances. There needs to be that, right? If there's the human mind and human nature is too flawed to just let it run free. And most people that are acting in good faith would welcome that, right? I've talked about George Washington before, other people in that vein, where they give up power because they understand, right? I don't want this absolute power. It's not good for the people. It puts too much risk in the system. But in these cases, that's kind of what you have. You have a group X that's saying, if you're not part of it, you're not allowed to talk. You don't get a seat at this table. You don't get a voice. You just listen and do what we're saying. And people can't process that. They can't digest that. And I get that, right? I get both sides. I get the feeling that it's justified to do that because you feel like you've been mistreated for such a long time. And I get the feeling from whoever it is that disagrees with it, whether they be within group X or outside of it, that that's not okay. That can't be the approach. I guess, so I said a question, right? So my question is to the rhetorical you, right? The people in group X. Have you thought through the logic fully? right? And when I ask this question, really, I often get, thrown back in my face this concept of like, fuck logic. What logic? Like, do you know how we've been treated? Like, do you know what we've been through? Has Group Y thought through the logic? Has Group Y cared about trying to do it the right way or be better? No. So fuck off. Like, this is what it is. And listen, I get it. I get that mentality, and maybe you're right. But as I always say, like, if you're so sure you're right, you shouldn't be afraid of looking at it a little bit, right? So just walk with me for a minute on this logic. If you are part of Group X, and the premise, the rule, the assumption, whatever you want to call it, that's being established is, unless you're part of Group X, you can't understand what it is to be Group X. You can't understand what it's like to live our lives, to go through what we've been through, to experience the things we've seen, to feel what it feels. You can't understand any of that. And that's the rule, that's the premise, that's therefore saying you don't get a voice in this. So again, walk with me on the logic here. The issue I see is if Group X is telling Group Y, this is what you need to do different, the same rule has to apply, right? It may not seem fair, it may not seem just, it may make you angry, but I don't see logically, and this is the question, help me understand, how does this rule not apply both ways, right? If Group Y can't understand Group X because they're not Group X, then Group X can't understand Group Y because they're not Group Y. So from a Group X perspective, you can absolutely speak your mind, share your views, illustrate, highlight, make clear the issues that you have with Group Y, the impacts of the things that they're doing, thoughts about why they're doing it and what they need to do differently. But you can't claim to understand them and how they think and why they do what they do and how they do what they do, right? That's the rule that's been set. If you're not in that group, you don't get to speak for that group. You just can't even understand that group. So logically, how could Group X in isolation determine the solutions for Group Y? What they need to do differently? I don't see it, right? What I do see is collaboration, communication, dialogue, to say, again, here's what I'm seeing, here's what's not working, here's my hypothesis and what has to change. Group Y giving their input and back and forth. And again, I get why that might seem like, again, fuck off, because Group Y has treated us like shit for a long time. Now I'm going to play nice with them. Well, it depends on your objective. If your objective is, I don't need Group Y, I don't want to have any part of Group Y, I want to go do my own thing. We've given them a chance. They haven't come through. They haven't stepped up. We're doing it on our own as Group X. Then okay. Then you do not need Group Y, arguably, right? It's probably a little more complex than that, but in theory, you do not need Group Y. Logically, I get it. But if the argument is, no, we're still going to be together as one, whatever that is, one country, one society, whatever it is, one human race, if we're all going to play in this together, well, then you do need Group Y. Again, I get that. Seems unfair and unjust and all those things, but you do. And if the rule holds that the only people that can understand their group and what makes them work and how to effectively change things within them is that group, well, then you need to work with them. And that's the thing I don't get. That's the thing I'm not sure why people aren't seeing. I could be wrong. I could be missing it. It could be me. But the question haunts me a little bit, right? And I get it. You could say, well, you're a middle-aged white male. Of course you're questioning. You obviously you're Group Y in this scenario, and you don't like people telling you what to do, and you don't want to be. You're probably right. I don't think anybody likes to be told what to do. I don't think anybody likes to be told that they're bad people. I get that. But it's not about that, right? That's not logical. That's emotional. And I can acknowledge that I probably have that emotional reaction. I try and detach from it because it's not productive in this case. But I can own it and be honest about it. What I'm focusing on is the logic, right? I'm not upset that you're telling me something about me and who I am as a person and what I need to do differently because it's hurtful and upsetting. I'm asking the question because logically, how could you do that? You've told me the rule is that you can't understand somebody unless you are them. You don't know how they work. You can't tell them anything because you don't know them. You aren't them. Well, then how does it work in reverse? It doesn't. It can't. I wish it could to some extent, right? I wish people that were acting in good faith who have been hurt in whatever form it is, racial, whatever, again, gender, sexual orientation, I wish that those acting in good faith could just say, this is what needs to happen, this will fix it. And if you care and you're a good person on the other side in group Y, then do it. Awesome. I wish that were true. But it can't be, right? Logic is logic. If the logic breaks, the logic breaks. So my point in this is, I think we have to work together. We have to be able to question. Everybody has to have a voice at the table, assuming they're working in good faith, assuming they're working towards the objective of fixing the problem between Group X and Group Y. You almost have to welcome that other side and that input. Otherwise, what's aside from the corruption and the ability to exploit the power, just logically, how could you assume you have the answer and the solution? You can't. You just can't. And we've talked about this before, and this gets back to the corruption point, but if you try and override that, right, that logic, and you say, well, I'm overriding it because we're clearly on the right side here in Group X. We're absolutely right, right? I know we're right. Maybe. But you have to be prepared then for Group F and Group, G and Group M and all these other groups that are going to come in with very similar logic. And they're going to say, hey, we're right about our thing too. And we now understand once you're right about it, you can demand, and you can't be questioned, you can just demand and people have to do it. There's a pretty infamous example of this, right? Which is religion, which is belief in God. And it could be any religion, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, it doesn't matter, right? Those people believe there's a spiritual being that lives in the sky or wherever they live who's dictated this, who said this is what has to happen. They are absolutely certain they are right. And you see what that's led to, right? When you feel like you know you're right and you override logic with that and you say, well, God said it, so we're going, right? It doesn't have to be God. It could be whatever your value system is that gives you that confidence that you're right. It doesn't override logic. It can't override logic because then it becomes a free-for-all. Everybody feels like they're right. And the crazy part is, a lot of people, most of them are right to some extent, but it's complex. They're right about portions of it. They're missing other portions of it. That's why you need the full picture. That's why it can't just be a subset deciding for other people what it needs to be. Even if that feels like what it should be. It can't. The logic doesn't hold, I think. So I make this video, and I recognize I might have gotten a little bit preachy here. Certainly I have a view on what I think it needs to be. But I make the video because if I'm missing it, if I don't understand it, I want to see how maybe the way I'm applying this logic is incorrect, where the logic still does hold in the approach certain people are taking, right? And back to that Group X. If Group X has it right, I want to understand it. The math just doesn't add up for me right now, and I'd like it to. Or I'd like to take a better approach because my objective, for what it's worth, for the extent that people believe it, is for the world to be a better place, to fix the issues, to help Group X, to help every group. But the math has to work. The logic has to work. And right now I just don't see it. So I'd love to see it.